There are wounds people can see, broken bones, scars left behind by violence, the marks of suffering written across the body. And then, there are wounds no one sees, the quiet ache of rejection, the invisible grief of feeling unwanted, the unbearable question carried silently for years, why was not I enough to stay? Because perhaps one of the deepest pains a human being can experience is not failure, not poverty, not loneliness, but abandonment. The feeling that someone meant to love you walked away, or worse, chose someone else. And perhaps that is why the story of Ishmael feels so painfully human. Because before he became controversy, before history argued over his meaning, before nations traced ancestry through his name, he was simply a child, a son, a boy born into circumstances he never chose, a child who never asked to become part of adult mistakes, and perhaps most heartbreaking of all, a child who was never supposed to feel abandoned. His name was Ishmael. Ishmael. But history often remembers him strangely. As the other son, the forgotten one, the rejected child standing outside a promise meant for someone else. We remember Isaac, the miracle child, the chosen son, the laughter after impossible waiting. But Ishmael often feels like a shadow standing at the edge of someone else's story. And maybe that is exactly what makes his story matter, because millions of people understand what it feels like to grow up in someone else's shadow. The child of divorce, the child from a broken relationship, the sibling who felt less wanted, the son who wondered why love changed, the daughter who quietly asked, "Why them, and not me?" Perhaps you know this feeling, to look at your life and wonder, was I unwanted from the beginning? Did circumstances decide my worth before I could even speak? Because rejection changes people, especially when it begins in childhood. Psychologists understand something ancient stories already knew. Children build identity around belonging. To feel wanted matters. To feel chosen matters. To feel secure matters. When love feels uncertain, the soul learns strange lessons. Sometimes anger, sometimes fear, sometimes relentless independence, sometimes the quiet belief, if I cannot be loved, he will learn how to survive alone. And survival can become its own kind of loneliness. But Ishmael's story begins even earlier, before rejection, before wilderness, before exile. It begins with waiting, longing, desperation, and one painful human truth. Sometimes adults make choices born from fear, and children carry the consequences. Imagine the world Ishmael entered, a household already full of tension, a promise delayed for too long, years of waiting becoming frustration, hope slowly turning into desperation. His father, a man called by God, a dreamer wandering toward invisible promises. His mother, a servant caught inside someone else's struggle. And somewhere inside this fragile household, a decision was made. A decision adults believed practical, necessary, reasonable. But life has a strange habit of turning reasonable decisions into painful consequences. Because Ishmael was born not merely into family, but into unresolved longing, into disappointment, into expectations he never asked to carry. He entered a world already emotionally complicated. And perhaps many people understand this feeling more than they realize. Children often inherit wounds they did not create. Parents struggling with disappointment. Marriages strained by fear. Homes shaped by unresolved grief. Dreams that never unfolded the way adults imagined. And the child simply arrives inside the storm. Never asked permission. Never understood the tension. Only learning quietly. Something feels fragile here, yet for a time. Perhaps Ishmael's life looked hopeful. He was Abraham's son, loved, protected, part of the future, the firstborn. Imagine the security he may have felt, A father teaching him survival. Stories shared beneath desert skies. The belief that he belonged. The belief that he mattered. And perhaps, for years, he truly believed he was enough. Until one day, everything changed. Because history sometimes turns on moments children do not understand. A promise fulfilled. A new child born. A family shifting. Love suddenly feeling uncertain. And a painful question quietly entering the heart. What happens when someone else becomes more important than you? Because rejection rarely announces itself clearly. Sometimes it arrives through comparison, distance, silence, changed attention, a look, a conversation overheard, a sense that something no longer feels the same. And for children, few fears run deeper than replacement. Will I still matter? Will I still be loved? Will there still be room for me? Perhaps Ishmael felt the tension long before exile came. Children notice things. Adults think, remain hidden. The shifting atmosphere, the awkward silence, the strained emotions, the feeling that love itself has become complicated. And perhaps, somewhere inside young Ishmael, confusion quietly began growing. What did I do wrong? Was I not enough? Can love disappear? Questions children rarely speak aloud, yet carry for years. And maybe this is why Ishmael's story still reaches across thousands of years. Because it touches something painfully universal. The fear of rejection, the wound of feeling unwanted, the quiet ache of wondering whether circumstances decided your value. Yet here lies the mystery of Ishmael's story. Because sometimes, the people who feel abandoned become unexpectedly strong, not because pain disappears, but because survival teaches resilience. The wilderness shapes people differently. Loneliness shapes people differently. The child forced to grow through loss often learns things comfort never teaches: strength, endurance, identity forged through suffering. Still, pain always leaves questions behind. And perhaps the greatest question of all hovers over Ishmael's story. Was he rejected by God or wounded by human choices? Because history has often misunderstood forgotten children. The overlooked son, the displaced sibling, the person standing outside someone else's blessing. But perhaps, just perhaps, Ishmael's story was never about rejection alone. Maybe it was about survival, about identity, about what happens when life begins unfairly, and whether pain gets the final word. Tonight, we uncover one of the Bible's most emotionally complicated stories. A child born from longing, a son caught inside family tension, a boy forced into wilderness before he understood why, the forgotten son, the rejected child, or perhaps, the survivor history misunderstood. This is the story of Ishmael, the child who was never supposed to feel abandoned. And before this story ends, you may begin to wonder whether rejection has ever truly been the end of anyone's story, or only the beginning of who they eventually become. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from waiting. Not ordinary waiting, not waiting in lines, not waiting for seasons to change, but waiting for something your heart desperately wants, something promised, something hoped for, something you once believed would surely happen, until slowly, quietly, hope begins slipping through your fingers. And perhaps one of the deepest questions human beings wrestle with is this: what happens when waiting becomes unbearable? Because time changes people. Hope changes under pressure. Faith stretches. Expectation grows tired. Even good people, faithful people, eventually become exhausted by delay. This is where Ishmael's story truly begins. Not in rejection, not in wilderness, not even in family conflict. His story begins with longing, a longing so deep that it quietly reshaped an entire household. To understand Ishmael, we must first understand two people growing older beneath the weight of unanswered hope, a man named Abraham and a woman named Sarah. Abraham, Sarah. Before they became symbols of faith, they were simply human beings, tired, uncertain, trying to believe something that increasingly felt impossible. Imagine their story. Years earlier, Abraham had received a promise, a future larger than imagination, a covenant stretching beyond generations, a family so vast it would resemble stars scattered across the sky, a legacy impossible to count. There was only one problem. No child, no son, no visible evidence that the promise was becoming real. Fat first. Faith probably felt exciting. Adventure often feels easier in the beginning. The future glows brightly when possibility still feels close. Perhaps Abraham and Sarah smiled at the thought. Someday, soon, the child will come. The promise will unfold. We only need patience. But patience feels different after years pass, especially when prayers remain unanswered, especially when silence lingers, especially when reality refuses to cooperate with hope. Days became months. Months became years. Years became decades. And still, nothing. No child. No miracle. Only aging bodies quietly reminding them that time does not stop for promises. This is what makes the story painfully human. Because disappointment changes people. Slowly. Quietly. At first, people trust easily. Then they begin wondering. Then questioning. Then bargaining. Eventually, they simply become tired. And tired people often make decisions they never imagined making. Imagine Sarah, year after year watching others become mothers, watching children grow, watching families expand, watching life move forward for everyone else. Meanwhile, her own arms remained empty. In the ancient world, childlessness carried enormous pain. Not merely emotional pain, social pain, identity pain, security pain. Women were often defined through motherhood. Legacy depended upon descendants. Family survival mattered. And Sarah carried silence, month after month, year after year. Hope slowly becoming grief. Psychologists understand something ancient stories reveal beautifully. Unresolved longing changes perception. People waiting too long eventually stop protecting hope. Because hope becomes dangerous. Hope hurts. Disappointment repeated enough times creates self-defense. Humans begin lowering expectations, preparing emotionally for loss before loss arrives. Maybe Sarah reached that place. The place where believing felt harder than surrendering. Perhaps she still loved God, still respected Abraham, still wanted faith. But faith grows complicated when time feels cruel. And Abraham, what of him? The scriptures often portray Abraham as faithful, and in many ways, he was. But faith is rarely as simple as history later remembers. Faithful people still wrestle internally, still doubt, still fear, still grow tired. Imagine Abraham hearing promises year after year. A son will come, a future will unfold. Yet every morning reality remains unchanged. No child running through camp, no evidence. Only age increasing, uncertainty growing. The temptation to ask uncomfortable questions quietly enters. Did I misunderstand? Did I hear wrong? Did I wait too long? Was hope itself mistaken? Humans struggle deeply with delayed fulfillment, especially when dreams matter emotionally. The business that never succeeds, the relationship never arrives, the healing that never comes, the prayer remaining unanswered, the future refusing to unfold. Waiting stretches identity. And eventually, humans often try solving pain themselves. This is the turning point. Because desperation changes decision-making. One day, Sarah proposes something practical, reasonable, understandable. A solution, her servant, Hagar. The idea feels shocking to modern ears. Yet in the ancient world, this arrangement carried cultural logic. A servant could bear a child on behalf of a family, a socially accepted workaround for barrenness. In other words, Sarah was not trying to rebel. She was trying to survive disappointment, trying to help the promise happen, trying to solve pain. This matters deeply, because humans rarely abandon faith dramatically. More often, they simply grow tired of waiting. They begin helping outcomes along, managing uncertainty, creating backup plans, solving what heaven seems delayed in solving. Sarah may have thought, perhaps this is how the promise works. Perhaps we misunderstood. Perhaps faith also requires practical action. Perhaps God expects help. Again, notice how human this feels. People waiting for healing seek unhealthy solutions. People waiting for love settle for relationships they know are wrong. People waiting for meaning chase success instead. People waiting for peace numb themselves. Humans hate uncertainty, especially prolonged uncertainty. Eventually, action feels safer than waiting. And Abraham, he agrees. This moment feels deeply revealing, because even faithful people become vulnerable under emotional fatigue. Years of waiting weaken resistance. People stop asking, "Is this wise?" and start asking, "Can I endure disappointment any longer?" Abraham may have justified it. Perhaps he believed, this solves the problem. This fulfills the promise. This eases Sarah's suffering. Perhaps he simply wanted peace inside the household. Or perhaps, like many people, he grew tired. Tired people compromise more easily. This is one of psychology's oldest truths. Emotional exhaustion lowers discernment. Pain clouds judgment. Long disappointment makes shortcuts feel reasonable. And so, Ishmael enters the story, born not from rebellion, but from desperation. This matters, because Ishmael himself never asked to become part of unresolved pain. He entered a family already carrying disappointment, already divided internally, already emotionally fragile. Children often inherit tension adults never intended, parents struggling silently, unspoken grief shaping atmosphere, dreams delayed creating emotional distance. And the child simply arrives inside complexity. Still, for a while, perhaps joy returned. A son at last. Laughter. Hope renewed. Abraham loved Ishmael. The scriptures make this clear. This was not indifference, not emotional absence. Ishmael mattered deeply. Imagine Abraham holding him, teaching him, believing perhaps. This is the fulfillment. This is the answer. Perhaps years passed peacefully. Perhaps Ishmael grew secure, loved, protected, the firstborn son, the future. But unresolved promises rarely disappear quietly. And somewhere beneath ordinary life, something remained unfinished. Because what humans build from desperation often carries hidden consequences. The waiting had ended, but not the tension. Sarah's grief had not vanished completely. Hagar's role complicated family dynamics. Power imbalance entered the home. Resentment slowly emerged. Pain unresolved rarely stays silent forever. And perhaps something else quietly happened. Abraham and Sarah stopped believing. Not completely, not consciously, but emotionally. There is a difference between theological belief and emotional belief. You can say you trust something while secretly expecting disappointment. You can pray while quietly preparing for silence. You can speak faith while emotionally protecting yourself from hope. Maybe Abraham and Sarah reached that place. Faith outwardly intact, hope inwardly fragile. And, honestly, how many people understand this feeling? Still believing, yet tired. Still hoping, yet afraid. Still praying, yet emotionally exhausted. Perhaps this is why the story feels timeless. Because waiting changes people. Especially when promises feel delayed. Especially when silence feels long. Humans eventually ask dangerous questions. What if I solve this myself? What if I stop waiting? What if hope itself hurts too much? Yet here lies the strange mystery. Sometimes what feels like failure becomes part of a larger story. Because Ishmael's birth emerged from weakness, from doubt, from human impatience. And still, he mattered. Still loved. Still seen. Still part of history. The waiting of Abraham and Sarah did not merely shape their future. It shaped Ishmael's entire identity. Because children born from desperation often carry invisible questions. Was I wanted? Was I the answer? Or was I only someone's attempt to stop hurting? Questions children rarely speak aloud, yet feel deeply. And somewhere inside this fragile household, tension quietly waited, because the promise was not finished. And soon, everything would change. A miracle. A second son. A laughter impossible to imagine. And suddenly, the child born during waiting would begin wondering where he belonged. Because perhaps the cruelest thing about delayed promises is this. Sometimes people hurt others, while trying to survive disappointment themselves. Before Ishmael became controversy, before theologians debated his meaning, before history connected his name to nations and centuries of division, he was simply a boy, a child, a son born into a complicated home. And perhaps that detail matters more than we realize. Because children do not choose the emotional worlds they enter. They do not create family tension. They do not invent unresolved grief. They do not ask to become symbols inside adult struggles. They simply arrive, quietly, trusting, learning who they are through the atmosphere surrounding them. And Ishmael entered a household already carrying invisible fractures. To understand him, we must begin with his name. Ishmael, a name carrying profound meaning. It means God hears. Pause for a moment. God hears. Strange is not it, because long before Ishmael ever felt rejected, his story already carried the language of unseen pain. As though history itself anticipated suffering. As though heaven knew this child would one day need remembering. Because, sometimes, the people history forgets. God notices first. His mother, Hagar, was not powerful, not influential, not protected. She was a servant, an Egyptian woman inside Abraham and Sarah's household, a woman living close to promises never fully belonging to her. Already, power imbalance shaped the story. Hagar existed beneath authority, dependent, vulnerable, caught inside decisions made by others. Imagine her reality, chosen not because of love, but necessity, expected to carry emotional burdens never fully hers, a solution to another couple's heartbreak. This matters, because Ishmael's identity begins inside tension, not intentional cruelty, but emotional complexity. Sarah longed for a child. Abraham longed for fulfillment of promise. Hagar became the practical answer. And Ishmael became the result. A child born inside hope, yet also desperation, desired, yet complicated, loved, yet carrying invisible tension before he could speak. Perhaps many people understand this feeling more than they realize. Children born after broken relationships. Children growing up inside marriages already struggling. Children sensing emotional strain long before understanding words. The atmosphere teaches lessons before language ever does. And children notice more than adults imagine. Parents believe tension remains hidden, but children feel silence, distance, resentment, the emotional temperature of a home. Ishmael likely grew up inside exactly this complexity. At first, perhaps things felt hopeful. After all, he was Abraham's first son, the long-awaited child, the answer to years of disappointment. Imagine Abraham holding him, teaching him, protecting him beneath desert skies. Perhaps Ishmael believed deeply. I belong. I matter. I am loved. Because love probably felt real. Abraham cared for him. This matters deeply. Too often, Ishmael becomes reduced to the rejected son, but rejection came later. Before rejection, there was relationship. Years of relationship. Some scholars estimate Ishmael may have spent around 14 years as Abraham's only son. 14 years. Pause there. That changes the emotional weight entirely. This was not a forgotten child, not an outsider from birth. For 14 years, Ishmael was the son, the heir, the future. Imagine what that meant psychologically. Identity forms deeply in childhood. Children learn belonging through repetition, security through consistency, love through presence. For years, Ishmael likely assumed life made sense. His father loved him. The household functioned. The future felt predictable. Perhaps he imagined one day inheriting Abraham's legacy, continuing the family story. Perhaps he dreamed like any child dreams. Yet tension rarely disappears, simply because people stop speaking about it. Sarah still waited, still grieved, still carried disappointment. Even if Ishmael brought some relief, unfulfilled longing remained, and unresolved grief changes. Households, quietly, subtly. Pain left untreated eventually shapes atmosphere. Perhaps Sarah struggled emotionally, not because she hated Ishmael, but because he represented something painful, a reminder, and answer that did not fully feel like hers. The child of another woman, living proof of waiting gone wrong. This creates emotional complexity, difficult to untangle. Humans often love imperfectly when grief remains unresolved. Sarah may have cared, yet struggled. Hagar may have felt pride, yet vulnerability. Abraham may have felt gratitude, yet divided loyalty. And Ishmael, the child absorbs tension without fully understanding it. This is one of childhood's quiet tragedies. Children often feel emotional realities long before understanding them. Something feels different. Something feels fragile. Something feels uncertain. But words never arrive explaining why. Psychologists understand something important here. Children raised in emotionally unstable environments often become hyper-aware, sensitive to moods, careful around tension, learning survival through observation, trying unconsciously to preserve peace. Did Ishmael sense fragility? Perhaps. Did he notice Sarah's pain? Maybe. Did he feel household complexity before understanding it? Almost certainly. Yet, for a time, life continued until the impossible happened. A miracle. Sarah gives birth. Shishak arrives. And suddenly, everything changes. Imagine being Ishmael, 14 years old enough to understand relationships, old enough to notice emotional shifts, old enough to feel insecurity. For years, you were the center, the son, the heir. Then suddenly, a miracle child arrives. The child everyone celebrates. The impossible promise, the laughter after sorrow, the future. What happens inside a child's heart when attention changes, especially a teenager, especially one already sensing instability? Psychologists call this displacement anxiety, fear of replacement, fear of becoming less important. Children rarely express it clearly. Instead, It emerges through behavior, withdrawal, anger, competition, mocking, acting out, pain disguising itself as attitude. The scriptures briefly mention Ishmael mocking Isaac. This tiny moment changes everything. But what exactly happened? The text leaves ambiguity. Was it playful teasing, sibling rivalry, teenage frustration, bitterness, jealousy? No one knows for certain. But emotionally, the moment feels understandable. Imagine the complexity. The child once central, suddenly standing at the edges, watching celebrations, watching promises shift, watching future inheritance redirect, and perhaps quietly asking, "What about me? Do I still belong? Will I still be loved? I still enough?" Children interpret change personally, especially when adults fail to explain emotional realities. And maybe Ishmael did what hurting teenagers often do. Acted out, not because he was evil, but because pain rarely stays silent, especially unspoken pain. Sarah sees the interaction, and fear enters. Protective fear, maternal fear. She worries about Isaac. Inheritance, legacy, conflict. The household tension finally surfaces openly, and suddenly, Ishmael stops feeling like son. He begins feeling like problem. This transition matters deeply, because children internalize roles quickly. Wanted, unwanted, chosen, complicated, safe, threatening. Identity forms through repeated signals, and perhaps Ishmael felt something heartbreaking. The shift, the distance, the subtle emotional change. The realization that belonging suddenly felt uncertain. This is where his story becomes painfully universal, because millions of people understand what it means to feel replaced. The child after divorce, the sibling overshadowed, the teenager feeling forgotten. The person realizing love suddenly feels conditional. And perhaps Ishmael's greatest wound was not rejection itself. Perhaps it was confusion. What changed? What did he do wrong? Why does love feel different now? Children almost always blame themselves for emotional instability. They assume fault, assume inadequacy, assume somehow they caused the shift. And maybe, somewhere inside Ishmael, a dangerous belief quietly formed. Love can disappear. Belonging can disappear. Security can disappear. Psychologists call this attachment insecurity. When early relationships feel unstable, people often develop survival strategies, hyper-independence, distrust, defensiveness, restlessness, the belief he must survive alone. Could this explain later descriptions of Ishmael? Wild, independent, strong, a survivor. Perhaps wilderness did not create resilience entirely. Perhaps rejection sharpened what insecurity already began. Still, the story refuses simplicity, because Ishmael was not merely victim, nor villain. He was a child born into adult complexity, a son caught inside unresolved longing, loved, yet unstable, wanted, yet complicated, protected, yet vulnerable. And perhaps that feels painfully real, because many human beings grow up exactly this way, inside emotional tension they never caused, carrying questions they never asked for, trying to understand wounds adults never intended. The tragedy is not simply that Ishmael faced rejection. The tragedy is that he spent years building belonging, before losing certainty, because losing something hurts differently than never having it. And, soon, the child once held securely in Abraham's arms would face the unthinkable: exile, wilderness, abandonment, or at least something that felt painfully close to it. And perhaps the deepest question already hovered over him: Can a child born inside tension ever truly believe they belong? There are moments in families when something invisible changes. No loud announcement, no dramatic warning, just a subtle shift in atmosphere, a different tone in someone's voice, a silence lasting slightly longer than usual, a feeling children notice long before they understand. And suddenly, what once felt secure no longer feels safe. Because families rarely break all at once, they fracture slowly, quietly, emotionally, through fear, through misunderstanding, through unresolved pain. Nobody fully knows how to speak aloud, and perhaps nowhere in Scripture does family tension feel more painfully human than in the story of Ishmael and Isaac. Because before exile came, before wilderness, before heartbreak, there was simply a family struggling to survive impossible emotions. A father divided, a mother afraid, a teenager feeling displaced, a child too young to understand the storm unfolding around him. And somewhere in the middle stood Ishmael, not evil, not innocent in every moment either, just human, young enough to still need love, old enough to notice change, to understand something important had shifted, to feel that uncertainty had entered the house. Imagine the day Isaac was born. After years of waiting, years of disappointment, years of grief. Finally, laughter, miracle, hope fulfilled for Sarah. Isaac was not merely a son. He represented healing, proof that waiting had not been meaningless, vindication after decades of pain. The child she believed impossible. The child she thought life had denied her forever. Can you imagine the emotional intensity? Joy mixed with fear, relief mixed with protectiveness. Because people who wait painfully long for something precious often fear losing it, especially mothers, especially after disappointment. Sarah had spent years carrying emotional emptiness. Now suddenly, everything she once believed impossible slept in her arms. Her miracle, her future, her security, her promise. And somewhere nearby stood another boy, 14 years older, a boy who had once occupied that emotional space. Ishmael. Pause there for a moment, because history often moves too quickly past his perspective. Imagine being 14, old enough to think deeply, old enough to feel insecurity, old enough to understand emotional shifts. For 14 years, you were the sun, the center, the future. Then suddenly, everything changes. The household celebrates someone else. Attention shifts. Conversations shift. Affection feels different. People speak about destiny in ways no longer including you. No one explains what happens. Yet somehow, you feel it? Children always feel it. The subtle emotional migration of love. Now, let us be careful here. Love does not necessarily disappear. Abraham still loved Ishmael. This matters deeply. But love complicated by tension feels different. Parents trying to protect one child sometimes unintentionally wound another. Divided families create divided emotions. And perhaps Abraham found himself trapped in impossible territory. A father loving two sons, yet knowing their futures no longer aligned. Sarah protecting Isaac, Hagar protecting Ishmael. The household slowly dividing emotionally. This is what family tension often feels like. No villains, just wounded people protecting what they fear losing. Psychologists understand something heartbreaking about blended or divided families. Jealousy often grows not from cruelty, but fear. Fear of replacement, fear of abandonment, fear of unequal love, fear of disappearing emotionally. And children rarely express fear cleanly. Pain often disguises itself as teasing, mocking, anger, withdrawal, defiance. The scriptures say Ishmael mocked Isaac, Wone sentence, wone moment. Yet history has argued endlessly about what happened. Was it playful teasing? Normal sibling tension? A teenager acting immaturely? Sir, something harsher? Mockery born from jealousy. The text stays frustratingly ambiguous. But psychologically, the moment feels understandable. Imagine Ishmael watching celebrations around Isaac, hearing promises shift, feeling the emotional center move. A teenager already vulnerable emotionally. A child sensing displacement. Would resentment emerge? Of course. Pain almost always leaks out somehow, especially when words fail. Perhaps Ishmael mocked because hurt children often protect themselves through sarcasm, humor disguising insecurity, distance disguising heartbreak. Perhaps he acted tough because vulnerability felt too dangerous. How many teenagers behave this way? The child hurting quietly, yet expressing pain through attitude. Adults seeing disrespect while missing grief underneath. Maybe Ishmael did not fully understand his own emotions. Children rarely do. He only knew something painful was happening. And Sarah sees it. The moment changes everything. Fear awakens. Because for Sarah, this was not ordinary sibling rivalry. This was threat. Threat to Isaac. Threat to inheritance. Threat to security. Threat to promise itself. Again, pause before judgment. Because Sarah's fear also feels painfully human. People protect what they nearly lost, especially after long suffering, especially when something precious feels fragile. Imagine waiting decades for a child, enduring shame, grief, silence, then finally receiving the impossible. Would fear not sharpen? Would protectiveness not intensify? Sarah likely saw danger everywhere, not because Ishmael was evil, but because fear magnifies uncertainty. Fear changes perception. This is important psychologically. Fear narrows thinking. People in fear stop asking nuanced questions. Instead, they ask survival questions. What threatens what I love? How do I protect it? And Sarah reaches a devastating conclusion. Ishmael must go. Hagar too. Imagine the emotional weight of that sentence. Remove the child. Separate the family. Exile. Distance. No modern parent hears this without discomfort. No reader avoids the ache. Because something inside us recognizes the cruelty. And Abraham, perhaps nowhere in his story does he feel more painfully human. The scriptures say he was distressed. Deeply distressed. Of course he was. This was not political tension, not abstract theology. This was his son, Ishmael, the boy he held, taught, loved, the child who had laughed beside him for years, a father suddenly forced into impossible choices. This is where the story becomes devastating, because sometimes life presents choices where every option hurts someone. Protect Isaac and wound Ishmael. Keep Ishmael and risk family fracture. No solution feels clean. No answer feels painless. Parents inside divided families understand this agony. The impossible balancing act. Trying to protect everyone, yet inevitably hurting someone. Abraham's distress feels deeply human because love rarely solves complexity. Love multiplies emotional pain. He loved Sarah. He loved Isaac. He loved Ishmael. And love, divided by conflict, feels unbearable. Perhaps he delayed. Perhaps he hoped tension would pass. Families often do this, ignoring cracks, avoiding hard conversations, praying things improve naturally. Yet unresolved tension rarely disappears. It grows, silently, until crisis forces decisions. And crisis comes. The instruction stands. Ishmael must leave. Try imagining the emotional atmosphere that night. Silence, confusion, fear. No one fully speaking honestly. How does Abraham explain this to Ishmael? How do you tell a child, you no longer belong here? Especially when the child remembers years of love. Psychologists understand rejection wounds deeply when attachment once felt secure. Losing love hurts more than never receiving it. Children internalize separation personally. What did I do wrong? Why was not I enough? Why are they choosing someone else? Even if adults explain circumstances, children feel abandonment emotionally. Logic rarely protects wounded hearts. And perhaps Ishmael's greatest wound was not wilderness itself. Perhaps the wound began earlier. The realization, something changed. Love feels uncertain. He no longer belong. Perhaps he saw Abraham avoiding eye contact, saw Sarah's tension, felt emotional distance growing. Children notice what adults think remains hidden. And maybe, somewhere deep inside, fear became identity. I am replaceable. I am temporary. People leave. Love changes. This is why childhood wounds matter so deeply. They shape belief systems, attachment styles, identity, trust. Many adults spend decades healing childhood fears of rejection. And Ishmael, his rejection became physical, literal, visible. Morning comes, bread, water, goodbye. Try imagining Abraham's face, a father handing survival supplies to his son, knowing uncertainty waits ahead, knowing separation wounds deeply, knowing no explanation feels enough. The text stays painfully brief, perhaps because grief often leaves language behind. Some pain becomes too heavy for words. And Ishmael, did he feel anger, confusion, shock, betrayal? Did he understand? Or simply feel unwanted? We are not told. The silence feels haunting, because silence often surrounds abandonment. Unanswered questions lingering for years. And perhaps here lies the deepest tragedy. Nobody fully intended cruelty. Sarah feared loss. Abraham feared division. Hagar feared survival. Ishmael feared abandonment. Everyone hurting. Everyone protecting something. And still, pain spreads. Because fear inside families often creates impossible choices. This is why Ishmael's story matters so deeply. Because modern families still fracture similarly. Divorce, blended homes, sibling rivalry, emotional displacement, parents overwhelmed by impossible decisions, children quietly carrying wounds they cannot explain. The details change. The psychology remains: fear, jealousy, protection, love complicated by uncertainty, and perhaps the cruelest truth of all, sometimes the people we love most become the people we accidentally hurt most deeply. The family divides. The future changes. The boy once called son now walks toward wilderness. And somewhere inside Ishmael, a question likely echoes: if love was real before, why does it feel gone now? Because rejection always leaves questions behind. And soon, the wilderness would begin answering them in ways nobody expected. There are moments in life when pain becomes impossible to misunderstand. Moments when confusion disappears, because reality finally says what the heart already feared. You are leaving. Things will never be the same. The life you knew is over. For Ishmael, that moment arrived quietly. No storm, no dramatic violence, no public humiliation. Only something perhaps more painful. Distance, silence, a father's sorrowful goodbye, bread, water, and exile. The scriptures describe the scene with devastating simplicity. Abraham rises early. He gives provisions to Hagar, places them on her shoulders, and sends her away. Pause there. Imagine the emotional weight hidden inside that sentence. Sends her away. How many worlds collapse inside those words? A home lost, security shattered, identity fractured, routine destroyed, family broken. And somewhere beside Hagar walks a boy old enough to understand something terrible. He no longer belongs. Imagine Ishmael that morning. No explanation feels large enough. No logic feels comforting enough. How do you emotionally process rejection from someone you love, especially a parent, especially after years of relationship? Because this matters. Ishmael was not abandoned at birth. He knew Abraham, loved Abraham, had likely laughed beside him, learned survival from him, walked with him beneath stars. For years, Abraham had been father, home, safety, and now, something unthinkable had happened. The child once central now stood outside the promise, outside the household, outside belonging. Psychologists understand something devastating about childhood rejection. Children rarely interpret separation rationally. They interpret it personally, even when circumstances are complicated. Even when adults try explaining, the child hears something simpler. He was not enough to stay. And perhaps this sentence echoed quietly inside Ishmael's heart. Why him? Why Isaac? What changed? Did I do something wrong? Questions children often carry for decades. Questions adulthood struggles to silence. Modern psychology calls this attachment rupture. When someone emotionally essential suddenly becomes unavailable, the effects run deep. Trust becomes harder. Security weakens. Fear grows louder. Many people spend entire lives healing wounds born from moments like these. And yet, the story does not pause long enough for grief. Because survival demands movement, the wilderness waits. And wilderness never feels symbolic when you are inside it. It feels terrifying. Imagine the landscape: dry heat, uncertainty stretching endlessly. No city walls, no familiar shelter, no guaranteed food, only distance, desert, exposure. The wilderness strips away illusion. Quickly, comfort disappears. Control disappears. People become painfully aware of fragility. Perhaps this feels symbolic. Because rejection often feels like wilderness emotionally. The place after belonging collapses. The season after certainty disappears. The lonely terrain between who you were and who you must become. Many people understand this wilderness. After divorce, after family fracture, after betrayal, after loss. The season where nothing familiar remains, where survival itself feels exhausting, where identity feels uncertain. And perhaps Ishmael entered that wilderness carrying more than thirst. He carried heartbreak, confusion, fear, the unbearable ache of displacement. Because losing people hurts differently than losing things, especially when love once felt real. The scriptures say they wandered in the desert of Beersheba. Notice that word, wandered. Not journeyed with purpose, not traveled confidently. Wandered, lost, uncertain, trying to survive. How many people today understand emotional wandering? The years after rejection, trying to rebuild identity, trying to trust again, trying to understand pain, trying not to become bitter. Wandering always feels disorienting, and wilderness changes people. Sometimes it hardens them, sometimes it strengthens them, sometimes both at once. Perhaps Ishmael felt anger. Anger feels easier than grief sometimes. Why did this happen? Why was not I chosen? Why was not love enough? Rejected children often carry anger quietly, not because they lack love, but because love lost hurts deeply. Pain often disguises itself as toughness, distance, defensiveness, survival, and survival soon became urgent. The water runs out. Pause there. The water runs out. Few sentences feel more terrifying. No safety net. No certainty. No rescue visible. Only thirst, heat, fear, and the growing realization we may not survive this. Imagine Hagar watching Ishmael weaken, a mother unable to protect her child. Few pains compare to parental helplessness. The person you love most suffering, and nothing remaining to fix it. The scriptures describe something heartbreaking. Hagar places Ishmael beneath a bush, then walks away. Not because she stops loving him, because the pain feels unbearable. He cannot watch the boy die. Can you imagine those words? The helplessness, the grief, the exhaustion, the despair. And perhaps here, the story becomes universally human, because everyone eventually reaches moments where suffering feels too heavy, moments when hope feels exhausted, moments where survival itself feels impossible. Hagar weeps. Ishmael weeps. Notice this carefully. The Bible rarely pauses for emotional detail, yet here, it lingers. They cry. This matters, because pain deserves witness, especially hidden pain, especially forgotten pain, especially children carrying wounds adults caused. Ishmael was not responsible for household tension, not responsible for adult fear, not responsible for unresolved grief. Yet he carried consequences anyway. How many children still carry adult pain today? Divorce, broken homes, emotional neglect, family conflict, addiction, silence. The child often absorbs what adults fail to resolve. And perhaps Ishmael becomes painfully universal here. The overlooked child, the displaced child, the child wondering if rejection says something permanent about worth. But then, something extraordinary happens. The story turns, not suddenly, quietly, almost tenderly. The text says, God heard the boy crying. Pause there. God heard the boy. Remember Ishmael's name. God hears. Suddenly, the meaning becomes personal, because even in rejection, he was not forgotten. Even in wilderness, he was still seen, even abandoned by people. He was not abandoned completely. This matters deeply, because many rejected people secretly fear invisibility. If people leave, does that mean I matter less? If love changes, does that mean I am unworthy? If I was rejected, does rejection define me? The wilderness whispers dangerous lies. You are forgotten. You are alone. You are unwanted. But the story interrupts the lie. God hears. The angel calls to Hagar. Do not fear. Few words feel more needed in wilderness seasons. Do not fear. Fear shapes rejected people deeply. Fear of abandonment. Fear of closeness. Fear of trust. Fear love may disappear again. Yet the message remains. Do not fear. God has heard the boy. Not Abraham's grief. Not Sarah's fear. The boy, Ishmael, seen individually. Personally, this feels revolutionary, because history often forgets secondary characters. The overlooked child, the displaced son, the person standing outside promise. Yet heaven notices. The angel reveals water. Imagine the relief. Life returning. Hope returning. Survival returning. And something deeper happens too. Identity begins rebuilding. Because survival changes people, the rejected child does not disappear. He adapts, learns endurance, finds strength. The wilderness becomes teacher. This matters psychologically. Pain shapes resilience. Not automatically, but often. People surviving rejection sometimes grow extraordinary strength. Not because suffering is beautiful, but because survival teaches things comfort never can. Independence, awareness, endurance, the ability to continue despite heartbreak. The scriptures later describe Ishmael becoming an archer. Strong, capable, a survivor of wilderness. Perhaps not coincidence. Perhaps wilderness shaped him. Rejection became resilience. Loss became endurance. Pain became preparation. Still, wounds do not disappear simply because survival happens. Survivors often carry scars quietly, questions quietly, grief quietly. Ishmael survived. But did he ever stop wondering, why was not I enough? Did my father love me? Could things have been different? Questions often survive long after danger passes. And perhaps this is why his story matters so deeply. Because many people still live, emotionally, inside wilderness, trying to survive rejection, trying to rebuild identity, trying to believe abandonment was not the end of their story, trying to trust they still matter. The wilderness reveals something profound. Sometimes what feels like ending becomes beginning. Sometimes rejection redirects rather than destroys. Sometimes survival reshapes identity. And maybe, just maybe, the child who felt forgotten was never truly forgotten at all. Still, the heartbreak remains. Because survival does not erase grief. And Ishmael's story leaves behind a difficult question. Can rejection shape strength without becoming identity? Because pain changes people. The real question is whether pain gets the final word. And somewhere beyond the wilderness, Ishmael's future still waited, not as forgotten son, not merely rejected child, but as someone history would remember far longer than anyone standing in that desert could imagine. History has a strange habit of choosing favorites. One child remembered, another overlooked. One story celebrated, another quietly pushed into the background. And perhaps no biblical figure feels more trapped inside someone else's narrative than Ishmael. Because for centuries, people have asked the same uncomfortable question. Who exactly was Ishmael? The rejected son, the forgotten child. The consequence of human impatience. Sir, something far more complicated, because depending on who tells the story, Ishmael becomes either tragedy or threat, victim or rival, a mistake or a forgotten promise. And perhaps the truth feels much harder to simplify. At first glance, the answer appears obvious. Shishak was chosen. The covenant continued through him. The promise unfolded through Sarah's son. Scripture says this clearly. Generations later, entire traditions would shape identity around this distinction. Isaac became central. Ishmael became secondary. The miracle child, and the child born from human impatience. Simple, clear, easy. Except life rarely cooperates with simple stories. Because uncomfortable questions remain. If Ishmael was merely a mistake, why did Abraham love him so deeply? Why did God bless him? Why does his story refuse disappearance? Why does Scripture pause long enough to let us hear him crying in the wilderness? Because forgotten people rarely receive that kind of attention. Let us begin with the difficult truth. Yes, Ishmael's birth emerged from human impatience, from exhaustion, from waiting that felt unbearable. Sarah and Abraham stopped trusting time, stopped trusting uncertainty, stopped believing promise would arrive naturally. And like many hurting people, they tried solving pain themselves. Hagar became solution. Ishmael became consequence. This matters, because Ishmael enters history carrying adult decisions he never chose. He did not ask to become symbol, did not ask to represent compromise, did not ask to stand inside theological tension. He was simply born, a child. And perhaps this already complicates judgment, because children should not carry the burden of adult failures. Yet history often forces them to. Children of divorce, children born into unstable homes, children carrying family conflict they never created, The emotional weight feels painfully familiar. Still, the covenant through Isaac remains undeniable. Scripture repeatedly confirms this. The promise Abraham originally received would continue through Sarah's son. The future of Israel, the covenant line, the sacred story. And perhaps here lies the beginning of controversy, because many readers unconsciously interpret chosen as rejected. Chosen one, rejected one, blessed one, forgotten one, but human psychology often misunderstands complexity. Choosing one thing does not always mean despising another. Parents understand this painfully well. Sometimes one child requires specific protection, specific responsibility, specific direction. Love remains, yet roles differ. Could this be true of Ishmael? Perhaps the deeper issue is not rejection, but differentiation. Yet emotional wounds rarely understand nuance, especially for children. Imagine Ishmael hearing stories about promise, watching Isaac receive symbolic significance, seeing emotional energy shift. Theologically, perhaps Isaac carried covenant. Psychologically, Ishmael may have only felt displacement. Children do not think in theology. They think in belonging. Do I still matter? I still loved. Will there still be room for me? This is why the emotional controversy matters as much as theological debate, because many people reading Ishmael's story secretly ask, what happens to the people not chosen? The overlooked child, the second option, the displaced sibling, the person life seemed to pass over. What happens to them? And perhaps here lies one of the most beautiful tensions in Ishmael's story. Though the covenant continues through Isaac, God never abandons Ishmael. Notice carefully. He is not erased, not forgotten, not cursed into irrelevance. Instead, God promises blessing, protection, a future, nationhood, descendants impossible to ignore. Pause there. Why? Why bless the other son? Because perhaps heaven sees differently than humans do. Humans rank worth. Humans create hierarchy. Humans divide value into categories. Important, less important, chosen, secondary, worthy, forgettable. But the Ishmael story quietly resists this logic. God hears the crying boy. God protects him. God opens water in wilderness. God promises future, not covenant line, but still future. Not central role, but still dignity. This matters profoundly, because modern people still live terrified of being less chosen. The sibling overlooked, the child never praised, the employee passed over, the friend forgotten, the person wondering, did life choose someone else instead of me? And perhaps Ishmael speaks directly to that fear, because being outside someone else's promise does not mean life forgot you. Yet controversy deepens when we ask harder questions. Was Abraham fair? Few questions provoke discomfort more quickly, because Abraham remains hero of faith. Yet here, he feels painfully human, imperfect, conflicted, emotionally divided. He loved Ishmael. Scripture leaves little doubt. He pleaded for Ishmael's future, cared deeply, and still he sent him away. Why? Obedience, family peace, fear of conflict, pressure from Sarah. The answer feels painfully unclear, and ambiguity frustrates us, because humans crave clean heroes. We want Abraham flawless or guilty, but real people rarely cooperate with simplicity. Parents make painful decisions imperfectly. People hurt those they love while trying to protect others. Sometimes survival itself creates impossible choices. Still, one cannot escape emotional reality. Whatever Abraham intended, Ishmael experienced abandonment. Intentions matter, but impact matters too. Modern psychology understands this painfully well. Parents often love deeply, yet still wound children, not maliciously, humanly, overwhelmed, fearful, divided, trying, failing. Ishmael's controversy partly survives because so many people recognize this pain. The child loving a parent, yet carrying unanswered hurt. The adult wondering, why did not they fight harder for me? Why did they let me go? Questions love cannot easily silence. Then there is Sarah. How should we understand her? Protective mother, fearful woman, or someone acting unjustly? Again, complexity refuses simplicity. Sarah waited decades, suffered deeply, endured disappointment. Shizek represented miracle, fragility, hope finally fulfilled. Fear shaped her response. Fear often narrows compassion. When people protect what they fear losing, others sometimes suffer, not because they hate, because they panic. Parents understand this. Fear for one child can unintentionally wound another. Sarah's fear feels painfully human, yet consequences remain painful. And Hagar. Perhaps history forgets her suffering most. A servant woman, used in desperation, then displaced. Forced into wilderness, carrying consequences others created. How many powerless people throughout history recognize this story? Caught inside systems not of their making, paying emotional prices for choices made above them. Again, no easy villains, only wounded humans navigating impossible tensions. This may explain why Ishmael continues provoking debate, because his story mirrors modern questions too closely. What happens to children of broken systems? Can rejected people still flourish? Does being overlooked define identity? Does unfairness determine destiny? And perhaps the deepest controversy of all, was Ishmael rejected by God or wounded by human fear? These are not the same thing. Human beings reject one another constantly. Fear, jealousy, self-protection, family tension. Humans wound. But divine abandonment. The text seems strangely resistant to that conclusion, because every time Ishmael appears forgotten, something interrupts. God hears, God sees, God promises, God protects. Not forgotten, not erased. Different story, but still story. And maybe this becomes deeply important for modern people, especially people carrying rejection wounds. The overlooked child, the forgotten sibling, the person feeling secondary, the adult still quietly wondering, was I less wanted? Did someone else matter more? Ishmael whispers something painful yet hopeful. Life may unfold differently than expected. Different role, different road, different future. But different does not mean meaningless. Painful does not mean forgotten. Secondary in one story does not mean absent from history. Still, the controversy remains unresolved. Some readers still see Ishmael as symbol of impatience, others as symbol of resilience. Some focus on rejection, others on blessing. Perhaps the ambiguity matters, because Ishmael functions almost like mirror. People see themselves in him, the displaced child, the outsider, the survivor, the forgotten dream. And perhaps that is why his story survives. Not because answers feel simple, but because the questions remain painfully alive. Who gets chosen? Who gets forgotten? Can rejection shape identity without destroying it? And perhaps most deeply, if life wounds you early, does that wound get final authority over who you become? History remembers Isaac, but Ishmael refuses disappearance. Still present, still remembered, still impossible to ignore. Not forgotten promise, not merely rejected son, something more complicated, something painfully human. Because perhaps the people history places in the margins, still matter more than anyone realizes. What if Ishmael lived today, not beneath desert skies, not wandering ancient wilderness, not carrying a water skin beside his mother through scorching emptiness, but here, now, in the modern world? Would we even recognize him? Or would he look painfully ordinary? Because perhaps the uncomfortable truth is this: Ishmael's story never disappeared. It simply changed clothing, changed cities, changed language, changed family structures. But the wound itself, the wound still lives, and perhaps millions of people quietly carry it every day. The wound of feeling unwanted, unchosen, emotionally displaced. The wound of wondering, why did not they stay? If Ishmael lived today, he probably would not be called the rejected son. He might simply be called the child of divorce, the child from the first marriage, the child growing up in family transition, the boy whose father started over somewhere else, the teenager watching attention shift toward a new family. And suddenly, the ancient story feels painfully modern, because father wounds shape identity more deeply than many realize. Psychologists have studied this for decades. Children build enormous emotional meaning around parental presence, especially fathers. Not because mothers matter less, but because fathers often shape security differently. Belonging, worth, confidence, protection, identity. When fathers disappear, emotionally or physically, children often carry invisible questions. Questions rarely spoken aloud, yet shaping entire lives. Did he stop loving me? Was I difficult? Did someone else matter more? Was I replaceable? Am I enough? This is where modern Ishmael begins. Imagine him young. Maybe his parents separate early. No dramatic hatred. No obvious cruelty. Just complicated adults making painful decisions. One parent overwhelmed, another emotionally distant. Maybe the father still loves him, but inconsistency enters. Weekend visits, missed calls, broken promises, new relationships complicating priorities. A new child arrives somewhere else. Suddenly, the emotional center shifts. Again and again. And perhaps the child quietly notices. Children always notice. The delayed text, the forgotten birthday, the distracted attention, the subtle feeling. I am no longer the center of someone's world. People underestimate how deeply children absorb emotional displacement, even when parents mean well, even when love still exists. Love feels different when divided, especially for children still learning security. Imagine teenage Ishmael today, angry, quiet, confused. Maybe teachers describe him as difficult, defensive, withdrawn, unmotivated. Perhaps no one sees what sits underneath. Pain, fear, rejection disguising itself as attitude. Psychologists understand something heartbreaking. Children carrying father wounds often develop survival strategies. Some become hyper-independent, never asking for help, never trusting fully, believing, if people leave, he will survive alone. Others become approval seekers, desperate for validation, chasing relationships, achievements, recognition, trying to prove worth, trying to answer an invisible question: will someone finally choose me? And perhaps modern Ishmael becomes one of these. Maybe he works relentlessly, obsessed with success, determined to never feel powerless again. Or perhaps he struggles. Anger, restlessness, identity confusion, risk-taking. The statistics around father absence are difficult to ignore. Higher emotional instability, attachment struggles, trust issues, anxiety, difficulty forming secure relationships, not destiny, but increased vulnerability. Again, this matters deeply. Because Ishmael's story was never only about rejection. It was about identity formed inside rejection. And modern culture quietly creates many Ishmaels. Blended families, broken marriages, absent fathers, emotionally unavailable parents, children growing up asking painful questions in silence. And perhaps one of the saddest truths of modern life is this: many people appear functional while still carrying childhood grief. The successful businessman secretly trying to impress a father no longer present. The woman repeatedly choosing emotionally unavailable partners. The teenager acting tough because vulnerability feels dangerous. The adult terrified of abandonment, fear disguising itself as independence. People often carry childhood wounds into adulthood without realizing it. Psychologists call this attachment trauma, early emotional ruptures shaping later relationships. The child learns lessons. Love disappears. People leave. Trust feels risky. Belonging feels temporary. And suddenly, adult relationships become complicated. Modern Ishmael may struggle with intimacy, part of him wanting closeness, part fearing rejection, pulling people near, then pushing them away, longing for connection, yet expecting abandonment. Many wounded children become adults, waiting subconsciously for people to leave. Because disappointment feels familiar. Familiar pain often feels safer than vulnerable hope. And perhaps this explains why so many modern relationships struggle. People do not only date one another, they date one another's wounds. The father wound, the abandonment wound, the fear of replacement, the fear of not being enough. Unspoken pain quietly shaping intimacy. Still, modern Ishmael's story is not only sadness, because pain sometimes creates remarkable strength. Rejected children often become survivors, resourceful, observant, emotionally resilient, strong in ways comfort rarely produces. The child forced to adapt learns flexibility, learns independence, learns endurance. Sometimes too much endurance, but endurance nonetheless. Perhaps modern Ishmael builds his own life, works hard, protects others fiercely, determined never to abandon people the way he once felt abandoned. Or perhaps the cycle repeats. This is another uncomfortable truth. Unhealed wounds often reproduce themselves. People hurt from absence sometimes become absent. Children learning instability unconsciously recreate instability, not because they want harm, because pain unexamined quietly repeats itself. Psychologists call this intergenerational trauma, the wound moving through generations. One person hurting another unintentionally. Adults passing pain they never healed. This may be one reason Ishmael's story matters so much today. Because broken families remain painfully common, and people often underestimate how deeply childhood displacement shapes adulthood. The child once rejected still lives inside the adult, still asking questions, still fearing loss, still wondering, am I enough? Yet perhaps Ishmael's story also offers strange hope. Remember something important. The wilderness did not destroy him. It shaped him. He survived, strong, independent, resilient. The rejected child became someone history remembered, not forgotten, not erased, still significant. This matters for modern people carrying father wounds, because rejection explains pain, but does not determine destiny. This may be one of the deepest lessons modern psychology increasingly confirms. Early wounds shape people, but they do not imprison people forever. Healing remains possible. Awareness matters. Naming pain matters. Grieving matters. People healing father wounds often begin with difficult honesty. Yes, it hurt. Yes, something was missing. Yes, the child inside still feels grief. Healing rarely begins through pretending pain never mattered. Healing begins through truth. And perhaps modern Ishmael finally learned something transformative. The wound happened, but the wound does not define me. This distinction changes, lives. Identity beyond rejection, worth beyond abandonment, meaning beyond family failure. Imagine modern Ishmael becoming a father himself, standing beside his own child, realizing something profound. He can become different. Pain may shape me, but it does not have to rule me. Cycles can break. Absence can end. Healing can begin, because perhaps the greatest fear of wounded children is repetition. Will I become what hurt me? Will I fail too? Will abandonment define my future? Ishmael's story whispers something hopeful. Not necessarily, because survival matters. Growth matters. Pain transformed matters. And maybe this is why his story feels timeless. Because the world remains full of children quietly asking, why did not they choose me? Why did love change? Did someone else matter more? Questions carrying enormous emotional weight. Yet the wilderness story still whispers back, you were seen, you mattered, you survived. The rejection was real, but it was never the whole story. If Ishmael lived today, he might look ordinary, quiet, successful, angry, resilient, lost, healing, human, carrying invisible grief while trying to build identity. And perhaps the deepest question his story still asks modern people is this: will your wounds become your identity? The place where healing finally begins. Because rejection may shape people, but it never deserves final authority over who they become. Every human life is shaped by wounds. Some visible, some invisible, some arriving suddenly, some growing quietly over years. But perhaps no wound shapes identity more deeply than rejection. Because rejection asks dangerous questions. Questions that do not disappear easily. Questions people carry into adulthood, into relationships, into careers, into the quiet moments nobody else sees. Questions like, why was not I enough? Why did they leave? Why was someone else chosen? Did I matter less? And perhaps this is why Ishmael's story still feels painfully alive. Because long after ancient deserts disappeared, the human fear of rejection never left. We still fear being forgotten, unwanted, replaceable. Still fear standing outside someone else's blessing. Still fear becoming the person left behind. And maybe that fear shapes more people than they realize. Because rejection changes people. It always does. This matters. The lesson of Ishmael is not pretending pain does not hurt. Pain hurts deeply. Especially childhood pain. Especially family wounds. Especially abandonment. People often speak carelessly about resilience, as though rejection magically makes people stronger. But suffering does not automatically create wisdom. Sometimes suffering creates fear, anger, distrust, loneliness, bitterness. The child rejected early often grows into an adult carrying invisible armor, protective walls, emotional distance, hyper-independence, the quiet belief, if I never need anyone, nobody can hurt me again. And perhaps many people understand this feeling. The person who struggles trusting love, the adult afraid of vulnerability. The person constantly proving themselves, the overachiever desperate for approval, the quiet fear beneath success. Maybe if I become impressive enough, someone will finally choose me. Rejection often creates performance. People spend years trying to outrun wounds. Money, achievement, beauty, success, relationships, validation. Trying unconsciously to answer childhood questions. Trying to prove he was worth staying for. But here lies the tragedy. No amount of achievement heals rejection by itself. Because wounds ignored rarely disappear. They simply change shape. Ishmael's story understands something modern psychology increasingly confirms. Pain shapes identity, especially early pain, especially relational pain. Children learn emotional truths quickly. Love feels unstable, people leave, security disappears, and suddenly, the child adapts. Not because they want to, because survival demands adaptation. Some become fiercely independent. Some become anxious people pleasers. Some fear closeness. Some cling desperately. Survival strategies, ways of staying emotionally alive. Perhaps Ishmael learned survival early. The wilderness demanded it. Loss demanded it. Rejection demanded it. And perhaps many people today live emotionally inside similar wildernesses, trying to survive what family wounds left behind, trying to rebuild identity after abandonment, trying to trust themselves again, trying not to let old pain quietly control new relationships. But here is where Ishmael's story becomes unexpectedly hopeful. Because rejection shaped him, yet rejection did not destroy him. Pause there. This may be the deepest lesson of all. Pain shapes, but pain does not own. There is a difference. Many people confuse the two. They believe, because this happened to me, this is who I am. Rejected, broken, unworthy, forgotten. The wound becomes identity, and identity built around pain becomes prison. But Ishmael's story quietly resists this conclusion. Yes, he was rejected. Yes, he experienced heartbreak. Yes, he faced wilderness. But the wilderness did not erase him. The rejection did not end him. History still remembers him. His future still unfolded. His story still mattered. Perhaps this feels deeply important in a culture quietly overwhelmed by wounds. Father wounds, mother wounds, divorce wounds, abandonment wounds, rejection wounds. Many adults still carry younger versions of themselves inside. The overlooked child, the forgotten teenager, the person still quietly asking, "Why was not I chosen?" And perhaps healing begins not by denying pain, but by refusing to let pain become permanent identity. This distinction changes lives. Something terrible happened to me is different from something terrible defines me. He was rejected is different from I am rejection. Someone left is different from I am unlovable. The difference feels small, yet changes everything. Because identity shapes destiny. People believing they are unwanted often sabotage love, push people away, fear closeness, expect abandonment, pain quietly predicting future outcomes. Psychologists call this repetition compulsion. Humans unconsciously recreate familiar wounds, not because suffering feels good, because familiar pain feels predictable. The child abandoned often fears abandonment so deeply that relationships become difficult. The person rejected expects rejection, and expectation quietly changes behavior. Perhaps this is why healing matters so deeply. Healing interrupts repetition. Healing says, the wound happened, but the wound does not deserve authority forever. And maybe this is where Ishmael's wilderness becomes symbolic, because wilderness often strips identity down. The false stories weaken, the performance weakens, the pretending weakens, pain forces honesty. What do I believe about myself? Who am I when approval disappears? What remains when familiar love changes? Wilderness feels cruel, yet often reveals truth. And perhaps the truth Ishmael slowly learned was this: he had worth before rejection, worth during rejection, worth after rejection. Because worth cannot fully depend upon human consistency. Humans fail. Humans fear. Humans leave. Humans disappoint. Parents fail. Families fracture. Love becomes complicated. But human failure does not automatically define human value. This may be one reason Ishmael's name matters so much. God hears, even in wilderness, even in heartbreak, even when family systems collapse, even when rejection feels overwhelming. God hears. The forgotten child, the displaced child, the angry child, the grieving child, the child carrying invisible wounds into adulthood, still heard, still seen, still mattering. And perhaps modern people desperately need this reminder. Because rejection convinces people of dangerous lies. You are less valuable. You were not enough. You are secondary. You do not matter. But Ishmael quietly argues otherwise. Different story, still meaningful. Different path, still significant. Painful beginning, still capable of beautiful ending. The rejected child survived. The forgotten son endured. The displaced boy became someone history could not erase. Not despite the wound, but without allowing the wound to own him completely. Still, let us be honest. Healing takes time. Rejection leaves scars. Some questions linger. Some grief never fully disappears. Life rarely offers perfect closure. Sometimes people never receive apologies, never receive explanations, never fully understand why someone left. This matters, because healing does not always mean answers. Sometimes healing means learning to live without them, learning this painful truth. Someone else's inability to love well does not decide your worth. And perhaps this becomes the final lesson of Ishmael. You do not choose your wound, but eventually, you choose what the wound becomes. A prison, or wisdom, bitterness, or compassion, fear, or resilience, identity, chapter. Because rejection may shape people deeply, powerfully, sometimes painfully. But rejection should never receive final authority over identity. The child left behind can still grow, still heal, still belong, still matter, still build something beautiful. And perhaps that is the question Ishmael leaves for every generation. Will your pain become the story of who you are, or only part of how you became stronger? Because rejection is real, but it was never meant to become the final sentence of anyone's life. Sometimes, it is only the place where a different story quietly begins.